This is the fourth lecture and fifth recorded video for our course. Today I will discuss Descartes' proposal for what constitutes the appropriate rule of evidence for perception and certainty. That rule is encapsulated in the specification that true perception is both clear and distinct. Last time I concentrated on the second meditation as a rejection of the proposal that we can find certainty through the imagination. What I emphasized was that when Descartes talks about perception, he does not mean sense perception. Sense perception has to do with sensory data input, things that we know from experience that we have from seeing, hearing, smelling, touching, etc. But for Descartes, this is not what true perception is. Perception is a successful recognition of what is real. Descartes argues that sensation does not have the capacity to do that. Why? Because it's always at least possible that we are either being deceived by our senses or by our imagination. Meaning, on the one hand, our senses could be faulty. On the other, we could be having an imaginary experience. We could be dreaming or hallucinating. The first meditation ended with the proposal that even if we are dreaming, it must nonetheless be that our dreams are based on previous experience of reality. But Descartes ruled this out in the second meditation, or at least he makes the case that he can do that. As we'll see in the weeks ahead, Locke and Hume will not agree with him on this. Neither will Hobbes, which I'll talk about in the next video. But for now, sticking to Descartes, we'll take him on his word that he has demonstrated to us that the imagination is not equated with the intellect. For Descartes, the imagination is in effect a sister faculty to the senses. The proposal that imagination gives us some access to the real world is based on the idea that all our mental imagery comes, at least at its most basic level, from sensory experience with real objects. For Descartes, mental imagery that we use in dreams is indeed derived from sensation. But for Descartes, that's the problem with it. It suffers from all the same limitations that sensation does. It cannot tell us what is real. The intellect, on the other hand, meaning the understanding or the faculty of thinking/reason, is a much better candidate for certainty. Why? Because unlike the imagination, it's not dependent on sensation for its information. Only the intellect, i.e. the understanding, can judge whether something is real or not. Why? We'll get to that in a few minutes, later in today's lecture. In the second meditation, Descartes deduces that perception, i.e. knowledge of what is real, cannot come from either sensation or the imagination. Why? Because neither the imagination nor sensation is capable of the kind or level of certainty that true perception requires. Judging that something is real is something only the intellect can do. This means that perception is exclusively the domain of the understanding. It is a matter of pure mental scrutiny. And this means that perception is purely in the realm of the understanding. Saying that perception is purely a matter of mental scrutiny puts perception in the realm of ideas rather than sensations. That doesn't mean that we don't have perception of objects, but it does mean that what we are engaging with when we perceive is not the objects directly, but the mental concepts that we have about those objects. We'll see this again when we get to Locke, who, it might surprise you to know, not only agrees with this, but has a far more detailed explanation for how it works. But to recap, Descartes understands perception as what I'm calling a success term. Descartes wants to use the term perception to denote an actual awareness of what is real and true. I have proposed that because of that, we can understand perception as being equivalent to knowledge. The question Descartes is trying to sort out is, roughly, how do we know that what we think we know is true? Perception is when we at least think we do have a good answer to the question, when we have a solid and credible foundation for saying, I do know that what I know of X is true. As I emphasized last time, this means that our most reliable perceptions are of internal thoughts. Why? Because conceptual truths, like the fact that he exists and that 2 plus 3 equals 5, don't have to rely on the fallible senses at all in order for us to determine that they are true. Today I will explain that idea in much more detail, so hold tight. But stopping here isn't going to be enough. Descartes does somehow need to explain to us how we know that our beliefs about external objects are true. Scientific knowledge does need to tell us about empirical truths. And so Descartes does aim to move from the I think to the, shall we say, I think about, as it applies to external objects. The wax example that I focused on last time is meant to prove to us that the intellect, i.e. the understanding and reason, can, in fact, tell us necessary truths about external objects as well as internal ones, i.e. of percepts as well as of concepts. What can the intellect tell us about these external true objects? It can tell us that they must have these basic properties, the things he called simple universals in the first meditation. Logically, it has to be the case that bodies have extension. Logically, it has to be the case that things that have extension have shape and quantity. That certainty doesn't come from the rudiments of the imagination as he proposed at the end of the first meditation. That certainty comes from reason. So with the wax example, he was able to prove that the intellect alone can tell us what is necessarily true about the basic properties of the wax. But where I left off last video was with the question of how certain our ideas actually are. He noted that some of our ideas are solid foundations of knowledge, things like the I think and mathematical equations. But not all ideas are so solid. Some are confused and indistinct. Think about his ideas in the first meditation. The idea, my senses are reliable, proved to be very confused upon analysis. He couldn't even answer the question, am I having a true sensory experience or no, with certainty. So he still needs to establish some rules of evidence for determining the validity of our ideas. And that rule of evidence is what he calls clear and distinct perception. In order to decide what perceptions are truly knowledge, he must determine whether they are legitimately clear and distinct. He specifies this in the third meditation, where he says, I am certain I am a thinking thing. Do I not therefore also know what is required for my being certain about anything? In this first item of knowledge, there is simply a clear and distinct perception of what I am asserting. This would not be enough to make me certain of the truth of the matter if it could ever turn out that something which I perceived with such clarity and distinctness was false. He goes on, so I now seem to be able to lay it down as a general rule that whatever I perceive very clearly and distinctly is true. So we can call this our first rule of evidence. Whatever I perceive very clearly and distinctly is true. Something is perceived clearly and distinctly if and only if it is both A, not subject to doubt, meaning clear, and B, fully understood as true, meaning distinct. I will return to this later in the video, where we'll see that it is possible to perceive something clearly without perceiving it distinctly. But this rule of clarity and distinctness constitutes Descartes' primary rule of evidence for deciding if something is real knowledge or not. It is effectively the gold standard of perception. If it passes this test, this rule, then we can know with absolute certainty that what we believe is real is actually real. And if you're thinking that this is an awfully high bar to clear, you're not alone. There is suggestion that even Descartes thinks so, but we'll get to that. In explaining this rule of evidence, I'll be following Frankfort's lead. He devotes the 12th chapter to parsing out what it means for a perception to be clear on the one hand and distinct on the other. He writes, "A convenient way to begin developing a more detailed understanding of Descartes' rule of evidence, that is, his rule of clarity and distinctness, is to consider what sorts of objects he supposes to be clearly and distinctly perceived." This aspect of his doctrine is frequently misunderstood, which sometimes results in making the theory of clear and distinct perception appear quite outrageously foolish. Fairly good sense can be made of the theory, I believe, if care is taken to avoid certain more or less enticing errors of interpretation. So then, what is a clear and distinct perception? Here's how Frankfort defines it. A clear and distinct perception is always a perception that something is the case. It always has a proposition as its object. Now, this is only half the picture. As I mentioned a second ago, there is a specific definition for what makes a perception clear and what makes it distinct. But before we get to that, it's an important bit of information that it is only certain kinds of ideas that are candidates for being a clear and distinct perception. Only propositions can be clear and distinct. What do we mean by that? First, we need to understand what a proposition is. Propositions are statements that are available for logical analysis. If you've taken any logic courses, you may have already had good exposure to propositions. Propositions are statements that can be determined to be true or false. They are logic statements that you can prove. But it only makes sense to prove statements that are asserting something. You can't do a logical operation on a statement like blue sky. You can, however, do a logical operation on a statement like the sky is blue. Now you have something to prove. Let's look at that again using the example of an apple. A statement like red shiny apple is not a proposition. There's no is. You can't prove anything one way or the other about a statement like red shiny apple. However, if you reframe it as a proposition by saying this apple is red and shiny, now you have something to test, something that you can prove is either true or false. This is because red shiny apple has no truth value. It's not the kind of statement or phrase that can be false. I'll show you what I mean. Imagine if someone said to you, red shiny apple, and you responded, false. That would be absurd. It makes no sense. Now, if you're thinking of a way that it is not ridiculous, in other words, a way that it makes sense, then you're probably converting the statement, red shiny apple, into a proposition in your head. You would be thinking about an implied proposition behind the words, red shiny apple. You must be converting it to something like, it is the case that this apple is red and shiny. Let's flip the color to make this a false statement. Now the apple is green. In answer to the implied statement, it is the case that this apple is red and shiny, now you can sensibly say, false. But without that mental conversion to a proposition, you cannot respond false. Red shiny apple has no truth value. It's just an identification of sensory qualities about the object. It's the word is that makes it a formula that is either true or not true. The is effectively an equal sign. The is, by the way, the word that joins the subject and the predicate of a proposition, is called a copula. As a proposition, the statement can now be converted to a formula like the kind you'll see in a symbolic logic class. You can replace the subject and predicate with symbols or letters, and with more evidence, i.e. more information than you have here, you can theoretically test the statement on its logical merits. But the point is that adding that is turns the statement into a proposition, i.e. it turns the statement into an assertion that has a truth value. Why? Because it's indicating a logical relation. P, i.e. the apple, is Q, red, i.e. red. In this case, the truth value is negative. It's a false statement. Or, at least, if we had some way to know for sure that our sensory perception of the apple was accurate, we could say it's false. And this is the issue. Some propositions are more reliably provable than others. Again, when it comes to sensory information, it's hard to be absolutely certain that your senses are not wrong. Perhaps you're colorblind. I have no way of knowing that my experience of this apple as green matches your experience. Perhaps for you it's red. Perhaps what I mean by the word green is what you experience as a sensory input that would look red to me. Let's look at Frankfort. The next few slides are going to reinforce what I was just explaining about the connection between propositions and clear and distinct perception. This slide is a repeat from earlier, but just to reiterate, Frankfort writes, "A clear and distinct perception is always a perception that something is the case. It always has a proposition as its object." Here's Descartes' own words where he's saying that non-propositions are not available to logic because they have no truth value. He says, "Now, as far as ideas are concerned, provided they are considered solely in themselves and do not refer them to anything else, they cannot strictly speaking be false. For whether it is a goat or a chimera that I am imagining, it's just as true that I imagine the former as the latter." Meaning what? That the thought of a goat is like red shiny apple. For one thing, it's not an assertion that has a truth value. And for another, when it comes to sensation of the object, you can't distinguish whether the experience is of a goat or of a ghost. Imagination and sensation, Descartes thinks, are experienced the same way. He also says, by the way, that this also applies to volitions, i.e. desires, and emotions. These aren't available to logic either, because they too can be neither true nor false. Meaning that it's nonsensical if someone says, "I feel sad," and you say, "False." Or if I say, "I want to go to the movies," and you say, "False." These are non-propositional thoughts, and so are not the kind of thing that gets classified as a clear and distinct perception. They're something else entirely. The kind of thoughts that he's interested in, as far as his hunt for knowledge is concerned, is judgments. He writes, "Thus, the only remaining thoughts where I must be on my guard against making a mistake are judgments." He also adds, by the way, that ideas considered simply as modes of thought that don't refer to anything are not subject to falsity either. So something like, "I am thinking of a Pegasus," is not perception because it's not a proposition that has a truth value. It's not something that can possibly be false. So to reiterate what I said earlier, though, Descartes is not only interested in self-relational logic statements like "I think, therefore I am." Concepts or internal mental processes are not the only possible candidates for clear and distinct perception. Frankfort says, "To have a clear and distinct concept of something is to perceive what characteristics necessarily belong to it." Mathematical equations like propositions of logic or the properties of the mind, like that it can will and doubt and understand, are ideal candidates for clarity and distinctness. It's much easier to reliably know the necessary properties of these because the basis of evidence lies within our logical reasoning itself. Why? First of all, math is propositional by nature. Except for perhaps in some experimental forms of math, the nature of a mathematical equation is that it can be demonstrated to be either true or false. Yes, you can make mistakes in doing math, but the point is that you can use math to test that your mathematical answer is in fact correct. Unlike trying to figure out the necessary properties of the objects of sensation, math doesn't rely on the dubious senses. Yes, okay, you can maybe see the equation with your eyes, but that's not the way that you test its validity. The method for testing the validity of a mathematical equation is purely of the intellect. Either your formula works or it doesn't. And provided that it's correct, it's going to come out to the same result, whether it's from your perspective or from mine. There's a necessity, a universality to math that isn't as obvious or reliable in the objects of sensation. Math is as inherently provable as the fact that he exists. It has true solidity. Now, do note that, for argument's sake, Descartes does try to find a way that someone could doubt the validity of even math. That's what the evil demon hypothesis is meant to do. I'm largely skipping over that step for expediency. He raises the possibility that there's an evil demon who is tricking him to such an extent that even his knowledge of mathematical truths is false. He then creates an argument to show that it is a logical contradiction to say that something all-powerful is evil. That's the ontological argument for God's existence that I trust that you've learned and perhaps also learned to dislike from other courses. Again, for expediency, I've decided not to get into that. Suffice it to say that Descartes at least does entertain the idea that he can be wrong about logic, and he responds to that possibility by first showing that even an evil demon can't shake the solidity of the I exist. He then also shows that logical thinking about mathematical truths shares that kind of logical solidity. But what we're more interested in this course is how Descartes thinks we know about the nature of external objects, about the world outside our minds. As I said earlier, but I think it's worth re-emphasizing to make sure that we get it, there's a way that this kind of logic thinking gets us to the necessary properties of an object. The wax illustration was meant to prove this. What was clear and distinct about the wax was that it had certain properties. It can melt, and once melted, it can take on any number of shapes. It was logic that allowed him to determine that the wax persists even though all its sensory properties have changed. What's more, those simple universal things, extension, shape, quantity, they actually can be deduced by logic and don't actually need sensation, meaning our visual or sensual experience of the wax, to figure out at all. How so? It simply makes no sense that there is such a thing as a physical body that has no shape. If it had no shape, no extension, no quantity, you'd have to conclude that it isn't a physical body at all. It would be something else. It would be a non-physical body. When it comes to these things, we can legitimately say that the converse is a logical contradiction. As much as saying I am, I don't exist is a logical contradiction. As for other things about the wax, though, what kind of smell it has, what its true texture is, this is harder, if not impossible, to deduce logically. Descartes does want to talk about the kind of certainty we can have about the objects of experience, but he's nonetheless going to accept that this kind of knowledge is necessarily going to be less solid than the knowledge we have of our own minds and of mathematical or logical truths. This is how Frankfort puts it. Perceiving something clearly and distinctly is essentially a matter of perceiving certain logical relationships. Some of the relevant relationships hold, except in the cases of certain necessary statements, between a proposition perceived and an evidential basis for believing it, that is provided either by another proposition or by some experience. Truth and knowledge are logical relations. They have to do with the logical connection between the proposition and the evidentiary basis for believing it. When it comes to math, logic, and the properties of one's own thoughts about things, those logical relationships are more easily tested against evidence, against other propositions. But propositions can also be tested against the evidentiary basis of experience, and these give us a less distinct, but still relatively solid basis for knowledge about some aspects of objects. As Descartes puts it, thus, the only remaining thoughts where I must be on my guard against making a mistake are judgments, and the chief and most common mistake which is to be found here consists in my judging that the ideas which are in me resemble or conform to things located outside me. I included earlier the beginning of Descartes' thought here to show his emphasis on judgment, but now I've included the following sentence where he identifies that it is the objects of experience, of things outside us, where we are most prone to error. So how does the rule that whatever is very clear and distinct that is necessarily true apply to objects of experience? Let's look closely again at that rule. Truly knowing something clearly and distinctly requires recognizing that no possible state of affairs is inconsistent with the proposition. In other words, as Frankfort puts it, clear and distinct perception is a matter of recognizing that there are no reasonable grounds on which a proposition can be doubted. As I said earlier, for things like mathematics and other purely logical propositions, this is attainable. But for things like external objects or sensory-based situations, it's more difficult to attain this level of certainty. But all is not lost, especially, or at least as Frankfort sees it. Frankfort makes the case that the rule of clarity and distinctness must allow for degrees of certainty with regards to sensory-based information. What does this mean? On Frankfort's reading, Descartes must be making room for us to be more or less certain about the objects of sensation. These are not going to meet the same bar as the I think, nor mathematical truths, but there is nonetheless a degree of certainty that can and does apply to external objects and the external world. But in order for this to work in the context of Descartes' clarity and distinctness rule, he must allow that we can be more or less certain about objects of sensation. In other words, clarity and distinctness, as a rule, must allow for degrees of certainty. For Frankfort, this degree of certainty is found in the different definition and different standard that applies to the two sides of the clear and distinct perception rule. On the one side, there is a certain criteria for what is clear, and on the other, there is a much higher standard for what is distinct. So perceptions, i.e. of propositions, can be clear or clear and distinct. How so? First, distinctness holds a higher bar of certainty. This means that anything that is distinct is also going to be clear, but not vice versa. A proposition can be clear, but not meet the standard of being distinct. Let's look at those definitions. Here's the definition of distinct. A proposition is distinctly perceived when it cannot be refuted without leading to a logical contradiction or a proven falsehood. Here's Frankfort's wording. A proposition is distinct when the perceiver understands what is and what is not entailed by the evidential basis that renders his perception clear. In other words, knowledge that is distinct is fully known. We fully understand the basis for the evidence for what is distinct. The way that we get that understanding is by using reason to discover that it absolutely has to be the case. It needs to be such that it cannot logically be otherwise. For example, I am, I exist is distinct. Why? Because its opposite can't be true. If you negate it and say I am, I don't exist, you're saying something that is impossible and logically inconsistent. Mathematics is distinct. A basic math formula, that 2 plus 3 equals 5, can't be logically negated. If you alter it, you're saying something that is demonstrably false. The definition of clear, though, is less stringent. It says, a proposition is clearly perceived when there is no reasonable grounds to doubt it. Or as Frankfort puts it, a proposition is clearly perceived when the perceiver recognizes that his evidential basis for it excludes all reasonable grounds for doubting it. Perceptions about external objects often meet the clear criteria. The perception Descartes has about the wax having the property of being able to be either solid or liquid was clear. There's no good reason to doubt it. It has both intellectual evidence and, as he showed, a sensory experience of evidence to support it. So if the criteria for something to be clear is that there's no good reason to doubt it, then the perception of the wax is clear. But it's not distinct. It's not, properly speaking, a logical contradiction to say that the wax is not capable of being either solid or liquid. This is why, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the fact that the wax, as a physical body, must have extension is distinct. This is the kind of knowledge where we can say it must be so, and so we can truly say that we fully understand the basis for this knowledge. Its inverse is a logical contradiction. So notice, since distinct is a high bar, that means that we don't know, since distinct is a high bar, that means that we know everything there is to know about it as a basis of knowledge. It means that it has to be that there is also no grounds for doubting it. This means that everything that is known distinctly is also known clearly. Here's how Frankfort puts it. Whatever is perceived distinctly, then, is also perceived clearly. A perception may be clear on the one hand without being distinct. However, there are lots of things, often sensory things, that we know clearly because we have no reasonable grounds to doubt it, but we simply can't know everything there is to know about our knowledge of it. Here's how Descartes describes the way sensory information can be clear but not distinct, as it applies to the feeling of pain. In the Principles of Philosophy, he writes, while someone is feeling a great pain, the perception of the pain is certainly very clear to him, but it's not always distinct. For men commonly confuse that perception with their obscure judgment as to its nature. They suppose that in the part giving them pain, there is something similar to the sensation of pain, which is all that they perceive clearly. And so there can be a clear perception that is not distinct, but none that is distinct without being clear. A person who is feeling pain, usually, except in some unusual circumstances, does not have a good reason to doubt that they are experiencing pain. So the feeling of pain is thus clear. But the person in pain may not be able to say that it is a logical contradiction that they are not feeling pain. Perhaps the person is just not able to account fully for everything there is to know about what he's experiencing. Is this pain caused by a legitimate thing that would make it logically impossible that he's not in pain? Perhaps sometimes this bar can be met. Perhaps a neuroscientist looking at a brain scan can say, it's logically impossible that you are not experiencing a true sensation of pain as a result of our experiment. But often we don't know the true source of our sensation of pain, and all we can say is, I am definitely feeling pain, but I don't know everything there is to know about the nature of this feeling of pain, such that I can say definitively that it isn't from some imagined source. Now, Frankfort makes the case that there is another important difference between what is clearly and what is distinctly perceived. He argues that clear is an either-or. Something either is or is not clear. That means that you either do or do not have coherent grounds to doubt the evidence of a proposition. So taking the pain example, you either do or do not have grounds to doubt that you're in pain. How so? Because if you were to say, I'm like 98% sure that I'm in pain, then 2% of you doubts it. So then you do have some grounds to doubt that you're in pain. That would mean that it isn't clear to you that you are really in pain. This is why even the most scant possibility of doubt was enough to rule out the grounds of certainty about sense perception in the first meditation. It might have been unlikely that he was dreaming, but he couldn't rule out that it was possible. And thus, none of his sensory perceptions were clear. Therefore, they were not distinct either. So this means that clarity is not subject to degrees. Something either is or is not clear. As to whether your feeling of pain truly connects to a legitimate physical cause, such that the opposite is a contradiction, is harder to prove. Because the bar for what is distinct is so high, Frankfort argues that it cannot be that Descartes thinks that something only is or is not distinct. If this were true, then nothing, certainly nothing about external objects, could possibly be clear and distinct. The threshold of distinctness is just so incredibly high that it suggests that we have almost no clear and distinct perceptions about anything other than self-referential logical truths. But Frankfort thinks this is wrong. Descartes does seem to want to apply some level of clarity and distinctness to external objects. I said earlier that the perception that the wax could be either solid or a liquid was not distinct, but yet it doesn't seem not distinct either. This might be a candidate for something that has a certain degree of distinctness. Frankfort writes, "To demand complete distinctness, on the other hand, is not reasonable. Even if it is attainable, a person cannot know that he has attained it." Isn't that right? If you had to account for everything you know, that you understand everything there is to know about it, that you can demonstrate that it is logically impossible that it's not so, wouldn't that eliminate almost everything you know? Even for things that you do know with a very, very high degree of probability, you would probably have to admit that there's no way for you to account for certain that you do very truly know that you have attained utter and absolute certainty. This threshold could even throw mathematical or logical knowledge into question. Do we really know everything there is to know about our source of certainty, that 2 plus 3 equals 5? Or that physical bodies have extension? Only God could attain that level of certainty. That's something even Descartes admits. Frankfort argues that Descartes must be allowing us to adjust our level of certainty to reasonable bounds. These bounds must be higher or lower depending on what kind of evidence we're willing to accept as solid in a given situation. So Frankfort writes, "The degree of distinctness that is appropriate in a particular case depends on the special circumstances of that case." So in this sense, we might say that clarity is the necessary condition for true perception. As Frankfort puts it, the only general rule is that each perception should be so distinct that the perceiver will not confuse what is clear to him with what is not. Meaning that for something to be considered a true perception of something real, you at least need to know it clearly, i.e. that you have no reasonable grounds to doubt that it's true. But as for the level of distinctness that goes along with that clarity, Frankfort thinks that all you can do is apply your judgment. He writes, "The sensible response is that this problem admits of no general solution. It calls for an exercise of judgment in each case." In other words, you have to use your judgment in each situation to decide on how high of a level of distinctness you can possibly achieve about what you're investigating. This is Frankfort again. "The appropriate degree of distinctness will always be a function of the uses to which the proposition in question is put, and of the confusions concerning it that seem troublesome." In other words, Frankfort is arguing that Descartes' rule of clarity and distinctness allows for a little vagueness on the distinct side. He proposes that Descartes should be understood as saying that the most ideal and certain forms of perception are both very clear and distinct. But Frankfort argues that something does not have to be very distinct in order for us to know that it's true. Put an asterisk next to the word very because you'll see in chapter 12, Frankfort argues that the word very is peculiar in Descartes' rule. He thinks that there is no very for clear, something either is or is not clear. But he does agree that, or he does think that Descartes means that something can be very distinct or less than very distinct. But what does all this amount to? It means that Frankfort thinks that Descartes does not think that we truly have clear and very distinct perceptions most of the time. True certainty is perhaps just something we have to accept that we don't have most of the time. Perhaps 100% certainty that our perception of the world is exactly as we perceive it is just not possible. And if this is unsatisfying to you, you're not alone. But as we'll see in the coming weeks, the empiricist philosophers who try to reconnect us to the objects of sensation end up concurring with Descartes on this. It's only in the late 19th and right up to today that you get a strong pushback on the idea that we just can't know for certain that our experience of the world matches the world as it actually is. But as for the early modern period, the idea we are left with Descartes is that certain kinds of propositions, logical, mathematical, or internal ones, can afford us a fairly solid kind of certainty. But even here, he has to acknowledge that we can make mistakes. Our math can be wrong, our logic can be off, we can make a deduction that seems totally right, but it turns out that it isn't. And what it comes down to is a judgment call. The best we can do is use our understanding, our logic, and reasoning to decide if our knowledge is correct or not. To make a correct judgment, we have to stick to the evidence we have and be mindful of how solid that evidence is. Is our evidence based on something solid? Is there something we can draw on within our evidence that does have distinctness, i.e., that has logical grounds for knowing that it has to be true? Or is our evidence dubious? Does it entirely rely on our fallible senses and thus lack even clarity? But as Frankfort sees it, Descartes is saying that as a minimum, our evidence must at least be clear. We should only apply the concept of certainty to things where we have no grounds to doubt it. And as for distinctness, we have to apply our logic and reasoning and decide if something is very, very distinct or just more or less distinct. The rule of clarity and distinctness then becomes a kind of general recommendation. Here's how Frankfort puts it. It's difficult to see how anything much better than this general recommendation of prudence could be provided. After all, how distinctly should a person understand what he believes? The vagueness of Descartes' rule of evidence with respect to the prescribed degree of distinctness is inescapable then, simply because there can be no exact general answer to the question of how to be intelligent. So on that perhaps less than satisfying note, we'll end our lecture for today. Next time I'll talk about what it means for Descartes to apply this general rule of clarity and distinctness to the objects of experience in the external world. This is where we'll see Descartes' representationalism. I'll also be talking more about Descartes' distinction between imagination and ideas and why Hobbes thinks that he's wrong about it. Thank you everybody for listening. I'll see you next time. Don't forget about the reading quizzes that are due on Mondays at midnight. Thanks.